In this video, I want to introduce you to the book of Nahum. Now, Nahum, of course, is part of the minor prophets, and he is placed at the seventh position in your English Bibles. So you have Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, then Nahum. He's followed by Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Now, collectively, of course, these 12 prophets were known as the 12, or the Book of the 12. Now, when it comes to dating the book of Nahum, it's kind of difficult, at least with respect to the first verse. Now, you remember in some of the other prophets, it's in that first verse, first few verses sometimes, when the prophets are described as prophesying during a certain time period. And what normally happens, as I'm sure you remember, is that in the first few verses sometimes the names of kings are given, and of course that helps us to identify when the prophet is doing his ministry. Well, in Nahum 1:1 we don't have any of that. In Nahum 1:1 we just read an oracle concerning Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum of Elkosh. So we don't really have much to go on here. Now this leads Walton and Hill to say, quote, "The book contains no chronological information in its superscription, so it must be dated on the basis of internal evidence. Because the oracle projects the downfall of Nineveh, it is logical to place it prior to 612 BC when Nineveh fell." So essentially what they're saying is because the superscription doesn't contain any helpful historical information, we're going to have to look at the contents of the book itself. In other words, look at the internal evidence. Are there things that Nahum talks about that might clue us in as to when he was prophesying? As it turns out, it does, because Nahum prophesies the destruction of Nineveh. Now, we happen to know that Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BC. And given that we believe that Nahum is a true prophet, and given that he prophesied that destruction, it follows that he was conducting his ministry prior to 612 BC. Now, Walton and Hill reason out, and I won't go into the details as to how they get to this conclusion, but they reason that the book of Nahum might tentatively be dated to 655 to 650 BC. So within that short time period, that they think that that's when the book was written. Now, among the other scholars that I've researched on this matter, they're going to be less precise. And so Walton and Hill are at least compared to the commentators I've looked at, they're more precise in their dating here. Okay, well, let's look at some important elements in the book of Nahum that I want us to keep in mind. Well, the first element is simple. It's a judgment against Nineveh, or a judgment against the Assyrians. Now, when we talk about judgment, we have to remember, as I've said before in other videos, that judgment as a concept in the Old Testament is not necessarily a negative thing. Sometimes judgment has positive connotations to it. Sometimes judgment is a welcomed thing. Well, when, you might ask, is it welcomed? When is it a positive thing? And when is it not welcomed? When is it a negative thing? Well, it depends on who's being judged. If a righteous person in the Old Testament is being judged, then they are going to welcome that judgment, because that judgment to them is going to be like a rescue from the chaotic world in which they live. Now, if you are part of the chaos, if you are a wicked person, an unrighteous person, in other words, then the coming judgment is not going to be something that you welcome. It's going to be something that you fear, something that's going to be dreaded, something that's going to be terrible, simply because you are part of the terrible. You are part of the chaos. So judgment as an Old Testament concept is, technically speaking, neither positive nor negative, right? Well, I mean, in some sense, it's always positive because, well, God's doing the judging, so everything he does is good. But anyway, in terms of the way it's received, it's sometimes positive, sometimes negative. It's neither inherently one or the other, with respect to how a person experiences it, at least, right? Well, we see in Nahum, at the very beginning, chapter 1, that God is a God who brings justice, a God who is a God of judgment. So we look, for example, at verses 2 to 3. It says, "The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries and keeps wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and the Lord will by no means clear the guilty." So anyway, anytime we talk about the wrath of God, immediately questions are going to come up. Questions such as, well, how does God's wrath relate to his love? And here in this passage, we see those two things joined together, as it were, and it almost seems to be disjointed, as one commentator said. Well, not really, right? God's love and His wrath, they actually go together in a way that is much more cleaner than maybe we would suspect. If you're interested in studying on just the wrath of God from a theological perspective, I want to point you to the videos that I've done entitled "The Wrath, Judgment, and Love of God," parts 1 and 2. So there are 2 videos to that. So go back and watch those. And I talk about how we might go about discerning what the wrath of God is, or how we might go about defining the wrath of God. Now, it's important to remember just in this passage of Nahum chapter 1, verse 2 and 3, that God's wrath here is depicted as being what it is due to His patience having expired, right? So it says that God is slow to anger, and yet it says that He's going to be showing wrath. Well, the only reason, therefore, He must be showing wrath is because He has let His patience expire. Like He has gone through the process of letting His anger be slow in being fleshed out. And so we can't just read this and think, oh, God's like really mean, or God's just really bad, or anything of the sort, or God's just impatient. No. This text assumes a long story of God's patience with the Ninevites, with the Assyrians, right? And we're just not getting that whole long story. We're cutting to the chase here, because this is a contextual book. Nahum is writing for his time, and we are peering into his time, and we need to put our feet in his shoes. And of course, he's going to know things about the Assyrians that we might not readily know, namely how they've been wicked for so long, and despite God sending messages to them to say stop and encouraging to repent completely, then they've just apparently not done that, right? Lots to be said about that here, but at any rate, I think that'll suffice. So this is one important element, the judgment against Nineveh, the judgment against the Assyrians. Well, there's a second important element that I want to point out. And the second element is this: Yahweh is the one true God. I think that's an element that is pretty explicit in this text in chapter 1. So we see in chapter 1, verse 3, it says, His, or Yahweh's, way is in whirlwind and storm, and the clouds are the dust of His feet. What does that mean? Well, not much to us moderns, right? But it's actually packed with some significance, especially when we keep in mind the ancient Near Eastern context in which this text was written. Okay, again, we've got to put our feet in Nahum's shoes, and if we do, I think we'll walk away having understood his message with a bit more thickness. Now, in order to put our feet in his shoe, we're going to have to start thinking like an ancient Near Eastern person, okay? And that means thinking with an ancient Near Eastern worldview. So, in the ancient world, there were many religions, as there are today, of course. But there were particular ways in which they fleshed out their religion, and the way they fleshed out or described their deities. And one way they described their deities was with their deities riding on the wind or riding on the storms or whatnot. So look at the way the ancient Near Eastern concepts of God were fleshed out. So we see this quote from Chisholm. It says this, quote, "The description begins with the Lord's marching into battle in the midst of the whirlwind, storms, and cloud. In ancient Near Eastern literature and art, gods, especially storm deities, were often portrayed as using the wind, storm, and clouds as vehicles, often in battle contexts. Several Old Testament texts picture the Lord doing the same. Assyrian kings frequently emphasized their power in battle by comparing themselves to storm winds. In similar fashion, the Lord uses the storm winds as his weapon." So it seems here that when Nahum describes Yahweh as being in the whirlwind or being on the storm, and how the clouds are the dust of his feet, meaning it really gets to the picture, a very visible one, right, imaginative one, of Yahweh skimming across the clouds, and the clouds, as they fold underneath his feet, act as if they were the dust of the earth. So this is God riding on the clouds, right? And again, That makes sense when we keep in mind the ancient Near Eastern concept of how deities operated and how deities came into battle. In the ancient world, the deities came into battle, well, riding on the wind, riding on the clouds. And so what Nahum wants to do here is to show that, contrary to all the other nations and all their views on religion, our God, Yahweh, is the one true God. He's a deity who is among all deities. In fact, the gods do not compare to our God, right? I think that's what's coming out. And in fact, this is more clearly seen when we keep in mind another passage from chapter 1. So again, chapter 1, verse 3, we see Yahweh's way is in whirlwind and storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. Well, when we read verse 14 of that same chapter, we read, quote, "The Lord has been given commandment about you. No more shall your name be perpetuated. From the house of your gods I will cut off the carved image and the metal image. I will make your grave, for you are vile." So what's going on here is he's saying to the Assyrian king, look, I'm cutting off your house. You're not going to have descendants to continue your reign. Okay. And that aside, I'm going to judge your gods. I'm going to come to the house of your gods, and I will cut off the carved image and the metal image. In other words, I'm going to destroy your whole system of deity. I'm going to destroy your gods. And so we need to understand this prophecy as having a supernatural element to it, an element such that there's a war between the gods, and there's only one victor, and that's the one true God, Yahweh, right? Not the gods of the nations. They're fake. They're not real. Well, they're no doubt inspired by the demonic realm, right? But they're not. They cannot be compared to Yahweh. Yahweh is the creator of all, right? So they're not his equals, and Yahweh's about to show that he has no equals, and he has no rivals, even among the gods of the nations. So Chisholm notes here, again, quote, "The Lord's destruction of the Assyrian king's idols would demonstrate his absolute superiority over the Assyrian gods." So the fact that Yahweh is going to destroy the gods, he's going to destroy the gods of the Assyrians, that's going to speak to the Assyrians in such a way that they're going to understand that Yahweh is the one true God. Yahweh is the more powerful God. And so there's a missiological element here to this, in the sense that God's name is being taken to the nations, and he's shown to be the true king. He's shown to be the one true God. Now, what does this mean for us? I always like to end these sorts of things with some devotional thought, or include a devotional thought when I can on these studies. So what does that mean for us? Well, there's a couple things I want to keep in mind. One, we have to understand that truth is so paramount, and when our lives do not follow the truth, then there are just simple consequences. And those consequences are enacted by God, and that's called wrath. And it's not a pleasant thing to talk about, but I think we have to talk about it. So again, I want to encourage you to go back and look at my 2-part series I did on the wrath of God and how to make sense of that in light of his love, okay? But the point here is that make wise decisions to follow the Lord, because if you follow the Lord, you'll find that you're living the life you were always made and meant to live. You are a human being, you're made in the image of God, so you might as well fashion yourself after the ways of God. Now, secondly, we need to understand that that's the best thing to do, because Yahweh is the one true God. He's the one God we should follow. So all of our other idols, all of the things we put our hopes in, we just need to throw those out and let Yahweh, let the one true God, destroy the idols of our lives so that we can see him for who he is, the one true God.